Someone asked why I didn't pray for my foot. And the way it's hurting today and tonight, I'd like someone to pray for it. I don't think I have enough faith. I remember in Rhodes Grove once, a man had 3 warts on his hand, and he was always bumping them around, and they were bleeding, and he asked me to pray for them. And I prayed and put my hand on my finger on them. And that was the end of it. The next morning they were gone. I was amazed and astonished that I had a wart-like faith. And I don't have enough for the foot. Takes more than a wart-like faith to heal a foot. How long should I preach? 10 minutes? Longer? I don't have any notes, so I don't know when to stop or when to start. I don't know the middle of it even. I want to tell you something about the first Alabama camp. Down about 40 miles below Birmingham. It was an old health resort. And someone bought it and built a pretty nice dining room or eating room and a pretty nice room to meet in, but did nothing about the old inn. And we went in there about 60 strong, and the inn had never been renovated. I think they had swept some of the rooms out, but most of them were festooned with ancient cobwebs, dusty hanging from the ceiling, and old doors hanging on ancient rusty hinges that had ghostly creaks in them, and you couldn't get them clear shut. There were no keys in the place. Some old iron beds, I don't know how long they'd been there, and old mattresses. Many of the campers had to sleep together, and the beds caved in the middle and they rolled together. And it was quite an experience. And there was a mineral spring there, supposed to have healing power in it. Glenn Clark was conducting the creative writing class, and there was a young lady came there weighing about 90 pounds, and she sat in his writing class, and she turned out some poems, and he was a professor of creative writing and literature in McAllister College in St. Paul. And he said to me after that class was over, I've been sitting in the presence of a genius, a natural genius. Now this young lady lived in East Texas, and they had about 30 acres, she and her husband. She married a man that was 30 years older than she, and he had never sinned in his life. When his mother died, he stopped growing, and he married this young lady, and as it turned out, to him, she was just a second mother. All the years they were together, she was absolutely faithful to him. In the summertime, he had a mule. I think he had 2 mules. And he made a garden on his acres there. And this young lady in an old log cabin that was drafty mighty little furniture in it. Had 2 homemade fireplaces, and both of them puffed out smoke. And she took these vegetables that he raised and gathered together some equipment from here, there, and everywhere. And she canned these vegetables over an old wood-burning stove. And she would sell some and hoard the money against the winter months and store up some of the canned goods, and they would dry certain things. And in this way they eked out a living. She was on a bus, I think, going down to the local bus, going down to the town, the county seat. I believe it was on the bus. She picked up an announcement of that Alabama camp. And she read it and had an overwhelming desire to go to it. She said it was almost like fate. And she scraped up all the money she had saved against the winter months. And she had enough to buy a round-trip bus ticket over to that place in Alabama. And she appeared there in that camp. When it was over, she went back home. The camp accepted her with open arms and took her in. She was a beautiful asset to the camp. And when she went back home, she went back to practice what she had learned there. And for 30 days, she kept a diary or a journal. Every night, she made up the entry into the journal for that day. And after she had practiced these things that she had learned in camp for 30 days, she put that all together in a manuscript and put a title on it, 30 Days Under Grace. And she sent that off for me to read. And when I got it into my hands and began to read it, I realized that here I was in the presence of a masterpiece. It was just like roots dug up out of the ground with the earth still hanging on them. Real stuff. And I urged her to send that off to Glenn Clark. And as soon as he got it, he recognized the same thing. Here's a classic. And so he published it. He published it under the name of one of her classical poems, Reckoning at Dusk. And it's been going, that was way back during the war, it's been going, it's been in print ever since. And it has gone all around the world, been read all over the world. And this lady has become famous all over the world for her religious writings. Not only that, but for years she conducted missions in churches all over the United States. And she was licensed to preach in the Methodist churches. And then tragedy hit. And she had an operation for a very serious thing. And all of her public work had to be taken away from her, abandoned. But she was not to be defeated. She read a book by J. Allen Boone called Letters to Strongheart. It was about that great movie dog. It was worth $1 million and insured probably for $5 million. One of the greatest dogs on earth, I guess, that dog. And Allen Boone was put in charge of that dog under a heavy policy of insurance, and I think under a heavy guard all the time. And he had that dog for about a year. And after it was returned, to its owner. He wrote about that dog in a book called Letters to Strongheart. That was the dog's name, a great German Shepherd. A dog that was not trained. It was an actor. It followed along the same type of direction that human actors and actresses followed, no training. It performed its parts. Anybody who is old enough to have seen that dog knows what it was. Then she later read another book by Mr. Boone called Kinship with All Life. And being a genius, she knew that she could raise these German Shepherd dogs. She got all of the information that she could get out of Germany or everywhere else about these dogs, and today, in her modified and overhauled log cabin in East Texas, she has great kennels there, and she produces these high pedigreed dogs, many of them champions, show dogs, and her pups. She gets enormous sums of money for just puppies. She's going to give me a 4-month-old puppy worth a lot of money, with all of its shots and everything taken care of. When I return next fall to my home out in the Mojave Desert in California, where I expect to spend the winter in meditation and writing. And she's going to give me that dog to be my companion out there. And I know what that will mean. These dogs are sometimes more than human. But what has all this got to do with what a communion service? Well, it's got this to do. Without this lady's ever knowing anything about it, I screened and winnowed out of her writings the first realization I ever had in my life about a communion service. I had never known really the meaning of a communion service before. To me, it had always been a ritual. It had always been a rite. It had always been a sacrament. And I would go and take it unprepared. I'd receive the bread or the wafer in my hand, and the words would be spoken, "This is my body." And I would take the glass of grape juice or whatever it was, and I'd hold that. It would be said, "This is my blood. Take, eat, drink, and in remembrance of me." And I would go out the door that I came in, never having received anything from the communion. But after I had screened out of her books in between the lines and on the lines what this sacrament really was, I knew that it was far more than a sacrament, that it was far more than a ritual and a rite, that the external sacrament was there and it was beautiful, that what I needed was an internal experience. And in the camp at Coronas, I got that internal experience after having come into a perfect understanding of what the communion meant to me. The man was conducting that communion who did a little differently. He made a very inspirational talk, I thought. And he talked about it. And while he was talking, I looked up at the table where the elements were. And I saw an immaterial light playing all over those elements. It was more than a light that comes from electricity or atomic energy. It was an immaterial, etheric, spiritual light, and it was just dancing all over those elements. And then they passed those elements, and they had bread, little pieces of bread. And I let them put one on the palm of my hand, and I suddenly realized what the palm of the hand was, and also the palms of the feet. And I looked at that piece of bread, and it had this light around it. And when I took it in my mouth, I experienced a state of ecstatic feeling, a deep inner experience. And the same thing happened when I took the grape juice. And ever since that time, I have always had an interior mystical experience every time I've taken the sacrament, the communion. But I've always realized out of that book that I had to be ready to take it. I learned in her writings, between the lines and on the lines, that it was practically useless to take this wonderful sacrament unless you were prepared to take it. And I learned that to be prepared to take it was to forgive everybody when you take it. Everybody on the face of the earth, in your community or in the world, or in the country, who had ever had aught against you at any time or still had aught against you, or who had ever hurt you, probably without cause, that don't go to that altar and try to receive something out of that sacrament until you have forgiven everybody. Don't go to that altar without being reconciled with your brother and your sister. Forgive, and then go to the altar, and you'll receive. And what I got out of that book about forgiveness was not what we think of forgiveness. We just call it a word. It's two words. Forgiveness, to forgive, means to give for. That's what it means. It means to give yourself to God for the person against whom you have entertained any resentment, any hostility, any antagonism, any hurtful feelings or thoughts. To give yourself to God for that person, that's to forgive. That's what I got out of her writings. I learned what forgiveness was. It's not just a word. It was an action. It was an experience. And I found in the Sermon on the Mount that that's the way it is. Don't come to this altar and try to pray. Don't come to this altar and try to get anything. If you've got aught, if you're holding aught against anybody in the world, against anybody in your community or anywhere, forgive. Give yourself to God for that person, against whom you have aught, then come to the altar, and you will receive. I learned also that through her writings that you should come to the altar in a tranquil frame of mind, and that you should come in a reverential mood, the kind of reverence that you find in churches, especially if they're very old. Reverence is a great power, It can hardly be violated. I once was a partner with another man who owned a saloon in St. Louis, and it was a rough and tumble place. Most of our trade was old vaudeville troopers, showmen, and it was noisy and vulgar, intoxicated men dealing in every conceivable kind of vulgarity in there and noise. Then the screens would push open, and in would walk a couple of Salvation Army lassies with their tambourines. They had their uniforms on, and those uniforms were symbolic of the reverence that was behind those uniforms. And when they came in, bringing that reverence, every voice stopped. And it would have been death to any man in that place, drunk or sober, to have said anything that would have offended one of those women, Salvation Army women. Reverence is a powerful thing. An old man that thought his wife was unfaithful to him, he'd listened to gossip. And he made an excuse to her that he was going to take a plane trip, going out of the city to be gone for 2 or 3 days. Actually, he didn't go out of the city at all. He was just going to catch her. But she thought he'd gone out of the city on a plane, and she was full of anxiety. She tried to pray for him. She walked the floor. She couldn't sleep, and finally she went to a friend, stay all night in her nervous state, and he slipped in, expecting to catch her out of the home. And when he found that she was out of the home, he was absolutely convinced that she was unfaithful and the gossip was true. The next morning he learned that she had been seen in a church, going into a church, and filled with anger, boiling with a homicidal mood. He went to that church in search of her. She wasn't in the sanctuary, but he found her in a little chapel, kneeling at the altar. When he went to that door, he stopped. People walk softly when they go into a church. The very walls of that church, filled with worship and prayer, cry out. Reverence is a tremendous protective armor, and it's very difficult to violate it. And so reverence. Go to the altar in reverence, and you'll receive, because reverence communicates reverence. Go in quietness and confidence, and you will receive strength. You have an internal experience in this wonderful sacrament. The Last Supper, when Jesus said, "Remember, eat this, drink this in remembrance of me. For this is my body, and this is my blood." And of course, those are symbols. But the reality of them and the symbols lies within us. And out of the symbols, we can receive the experience. Communion is an experience and not a rite nor a ritual nor a sacrament. It's far beyond that. So we're going to have an opportunity tonight, and I'm not going to take up any more time.